Yeah, you can go ahead. I can also admit people, so I will do that.
Perfect, because my computer seems to be buckling under the strain. So, but we're recording now, so we'll make a start. Welcome everybody to this Roses Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. It's our 50th such meeting. We've been going for over a year now, but with the virtue of holidays and things, it's not quite 50 talks. We're delighted that the 50th is firstly joint with the S Training Network, and I'll hand over to Christophe Lay in a moment. But we're particularly delighted today that we can we can have Stefan Szymanski to talk to us, giving I wouldn't say reincarnation, but an update of his 1999 paper, prophesying about a European Super League many years ahead of the momentous and chaotic events of the last week. Before I hand over to Stefan, I'm going to hand over first to Christophe Lay, who organizes the S Training Network, and he's going to say a few words about that.
Yes, thank you very much, James. So indeed, well, since the start of this year, we have joined forces, our S Training Network, which is an international network for sports science and data science, and we have monthly seminars, which have since the beginning of the year also been part of the Nice Roses series. And for this month, we had for the first time, it's a speaker from the Roses seminar that is also taking over the S Training talk. So we are very happy for that, and very much looking forward to the talk of Stefan. What I still want to say is that if there are people who wish to be regularly part of, I mean, you all will always receive notification of our seminars. But if you want to be officially also part of the network, you can just write to me or write in the chat, and I will pick that up. So yeah, that's all from my side. Then I think we can go ahead with Stefan.
Go ahead, Stefan.
Right. So good morning, everybody from Michigan. Let me share my screen. Tell me, James, is that working?
It looks like it.
Yeah, very good.
Yes, perfect. Did you go to full screen yet? Perfect.
Okay, great. So so I want to begin with an apology to Gidon Jakar, who's I was meant to be presenting our joint paper on new stadiums in English football, and with the events of this week, I rather cheekily suggested that I might give an update on a paper from 22 years ago, and so Gidon is probably really irritated with me, so I will be apologies for that. I will try to make it up to you somehow. But as I say, 22 years ago with Tom Hoehn, I wrote a paper called The Americanization of European Football, which was about the idea of a European Super League. I don't know if you've heard of this idea at all, but the idea is that big clubs in Europe would get together and form their own league. It's a sort of a concept that has been actually around for quite a long time. Of course, it flamed out spectacularly this week. So as somebody suggested, maybe I should have dropped this talk and gone back to the stadium talk. But I do think it's an opportunity to reflect on the idea of a super league from an economic perspective and think about what we as economists have to say about this, if anything. And in particular, my own research agenda has in many ways been driven by this issue for much of the last 22 years. And so I wanted to share my thoughts on that. And hopefully I won't drone on for too long so that there's a good chance for everybody else to share their ideas as well, since I think this is a topic on which economists ought to have something. So I want to frame this essentially as an economic puzzle. I think we can put it this way. There are two league systems that exist in the world. There's the league system that is established in the US and North America, which is a closed league system based on exclusive territories, where entry into the league is contingent on payment of a franchise fee. So it's an economic transaction. And that contrasts with the system which operates pretty much everywhere else in the rest of the world. And I know there are exceptions and people might raise some of these at a later stage. But essentially, the global system is one where within each territory, there is a hierarchy of leagues. And within that hierarchy, there is a system of entry on merit to each level of the hierarchy, typically through the system of promotion and relegation. So teams can start at the bottom and work their way up, and also teams can at the top can fall down the system and end up playing at lower levels. And for economists, surely the question here, or there's really two questions here for an economist to think about, which is, what's the economic equilibrium? It's particularly, one would think that the equilibrium would involve one of these systems dominating. And it'd be sort of unusual from an economist's perspective to think about there being multiple different systems coexisting across the world. You'd think that one system would in some sense win out. And then the other question about the economic equilibrium and the classic economic question is welfare maximizing. So what are the welfare properties of different systems, and what if there is an economic equilibrium, what would be the welfare implications of that? So, of course, when we say equilibrium, we need to say a little more about what we mean by the equilibrium concept. And of course, a classic, standard economic equilibrium concept is supply and demand. And immediately one would think that there's a little bit of a puzzle here about the notion of a super league concept, or certainly a league concept which involved more competition amongst the big teams, because clearly UEFA has been responding to excess demand for many decades now, and by expanding the quantity of competition which is available for among the biggest clubs in the European context, I don't think there's much question, and we might want to discuss that later. I will give you a little bit of evidence later on, but I don't think there really is much question that the Super League concept for European football would attract a huge global viewership. So in some sense, there's pent-up demand. So if we adopt simply a supply and demand based framework for thinking about this, then it seems like that something like a Super League would make a lot of sense. But it's not the only type of equilibrium concept we could use, and another way of framing this is to think about more with an industrial sort of economics kind of framework, and thinking about these as firms that are maximizing some objective. Maybe they're profit maximizing firms, and to think about what would be the Nash equilibrium amongst profit maximizing firms. And one way to think about that is to think about what is the coalition of clubs which would maximize total profits whilst leaving no incentive for other clubs to form a rival competition. That would seem to be the logical way of thinking about a game theoretic equilibrium for sports leagues. And one thing I think to point out about this is that sports leagues do appear in many ways to be inherently monopolistic. So you either look at the closed leagues in North America, which dominate competition in their leagues, the major professional leagues in North America, or you think of the governance of football globally, which is controlled through a hierarchy of governing bodies with FIFA at the top, UEFA in Europe, national associations, which ultimately control all forms of competition. So, and of course, and the question then is there a role for competition at all in the economic sense, or is obviously this is about, we're talking about sporting competition, and we should separate in our minds the idea of sporting competition and economic competition. But is this? Do we have to? Is there a natural monopoly here in some ways? And again, with the question, the welfare question is always going to be, if there's a natural monopoly, what should we do about it? We know that natural monopolies will lead to welfare losses if left unregulated, and therefore, is there something that we should do about this context? Or, of course, there's this sort of null hypothesis here right at the end, which is to say economics has nothing useful to say on this issue. This is all just about culture and social issues, and economists are just whistling in the wind here, which is I think, but as economists, we have to explore that possibility. Obviously, we should generally be inclined to reject the null hypothesis here, but I think it bears some thought and discussion. I want to go back to the paper that Tom and I wrote back in 1999. We actually wrote the paper in 1998. So this is really a very long time ago. I was digging out the original slides that I prepared for the presentation when we presented this to the economic policy panel in Vienna, I think it was. And back then, 1998, the world of sports economics looked very different. So, and if you think about what had been written up until that stage about the organization of leagues and structures, really very little. There was an American literature written about how major leagues were organized, the famous papers of people like Rothenberg, and of course Rod Fort and Jerry Scully and Roger Knoll and these others who had focused on primarily on the way that North American leagues were organized. And then, as far as the world of football was concerned, European football in Europe, very little was written. You had the famous papers of Peter Sloan from '69 and '71, which were way ahead of their time in many ways, and did, in broad terms, discuss some of these differences, but didn't really go into great detail. Other than that, the research in Europe on sports was work on attendance demand, which didn't really take into account the difference in the systems in North America and Europe to a great extent. Again, mentioned them in passing. There was some work on gambling in sports, but really very little. Again, a survey paper by Jennett and Sloan from 1986, which was a rather nice survey paper. Again, very little setting out in detail the analysis of the differences between the league structures in North America and Europe. And that's one of the things we set out to do in the paper. And this table was something that we set up in order to try and draw attention to really the very different ways in which the systems worked. And the thing that we put at the top, the league system, the idea of this distinction between a closed system and an open system with promotion and relegation. And so that was the framework for thinking about our paper. And what we tried to do was to think about where this was going in the context of what was happening at the time, which in the 1990s were only recently had the Champions League been invented at all. Prior to that, it was known as the European Cup and was a knockout tournament involving just the national champions in each country. And in the 90s, UEFA had expanded this competition precisely to meet the pent-up demand for games between big clubs from different countries. So bringing the Manchester Uniteds up against the Real Madrids and the Juventus and Bayern Munichs of the world, that was part of this process, which was clearly UEFA was trying to negotiate. And indeed, under the threat at the time of those big clubs breaking away and forming their own Super League. So we tried in the paper to puzzle through the economics of this, and we developed a simple model to model a world in which some teams compete in domestic competitions, but then a subset of those teams also compete in an international competition. And what we concluded was that this system was fundamentally unstable in the long term, or not viable in the long term. And the reason being that in this system, the big clubs competing in the international tournament would come to dominate their domestic league to such an extent that people would lose interest entirely in it. And one of the key assumptions in that conclusion was that the competitive imbalance in the league would lead to a collapse in demand in the long term. And indeed, one of the things we showed theoretically was that even if you introduced revenue sharing at the domestic level, that wouldn't help you. And that was based on an analysis of based on the economic incentives in the model. In the contest model, the incentives would be for the small club to see the big club become even more dominant, so it could be more competitive in the international competition, and then share the revenue from that back with the weak domestic team. And indeed, that was that theoretical insight went on to be with Stefan Szymanski paper about the perverse incentives of gate revenue sharing in general. So that was how we reached our conclusion back in 1999 that in some ways the open league system was doomed, and that the closed Super League was in some sense inevitable. And I'm going to bring us back to this key assumption that we made, that this would be driven by the lack of demand due to competitive imbalance in the domestic competition. But just to briefly talk about what we generated a number of different ideas of how this Super League might work, and what in theory we were suggesting, although we were saying, well, we couldn't forecast exactly how it would go, but we thought that a sensible kind of structure would be to have a large competition organized on a conference-based system, and where teams would play each other, play within conference games and between conference games, and the interconference games would be based on the strength of the teams, and that would therefore enable both to preserve some of the best parts of the domestic league structures, but also giving opportunities for the big clubs to play each other more often. And we were pretty open in saying that we drew this idea from the NFL. We thought that made sense, in much as the NFL does a similar thing. The only thing that we were adding really was we thought this could be much larger in order to accommodate to some extent the diversity of teams in the European system. And I've put in here this quote about promotion and relegation, and we thought we put forward a number of arguments against promotion and relegation. One being that the teams, some of the teams that got promoted would provide very weak competition, which would limit interest of the fans, and that the other problem being that big teams, if they got relegated, that would destroy interest in the competition as well, in the top competition, and that would be problematic. So it's probably fair to say that since then I've changed my mind about this. Tom and I have been chatting about this as well, and I think it's also true for him as well to some extent, although we're still talking about ways in which our views have changed. But what I want to but in some ways, this paper set out the research agenda that I've been following for much of the last 2 decades. And I want to sort of really explain how I think my thinking has evolved based on pursuing research that's generated out of this paper, and really out of this comparison of the two league organizing systems. So this research agenda really seems to me to go into the following areas. So how does the open system affect the nature of competition? How does it affect competitive balance? How does it affect overall demand for the competition? And how does it affect what you might call effort, or the amount, the resources that competitors devote to winning, and how does it affect profitability? Then secondly, what's the role of financial viability in this world? And thirdly, what are the antitrust implications? So the first thing I think is, and what came quite soon after the paper, was I certainly developed a strong sense of skepticism about the competitive balance argument. And so again, the thing I would point to in the paper that we said then that I just really don't believe very much anymore. My JEL paper in 2003 made the point, based on research, so a lot of the demand research by, again, people like Rob Simmons and David Forrest and others, which showed that actually home fans that is far and away an important factor in determining demand, and so that unbalanced competitions can be incredibly popular and generate huge amounts of attendance. I also edited an edition of the Oxford Review of Economic Policy in 2003 and asked Jeff Borland and Rob McDonald to write a paper about surveying the demand for sport, which is an extremely highly cited paper. And one of the things they did was survey the competitive balance literature. They took a slightly different view. They agreed that demand was for individual games did not seem to depend very much on the competitive balance, and in fact, very unbalanced games could be very unattractive. But they raised the argument that that unbalanced competitions in general can diminish interest, and so that particularly if you think of the idea of how many teams have a chance to win the championship, if championships become very predictable and only a small subset of teams can win, then that can negatively affect demand. And that's an issue which I think is still, there's been some subsequent research. I think there's now would be a very good time for somebody to do a follow-up meta-analysis of the competitive balance arguments and try and set out what the consensus is. There have been many more papers since 2003, and some meta-analysis would be welcome, I think. But in many ways, this question attracted the interest of myself and then colleague at Imperial College, Tommaso Valetti, and we teamed up with Luigi Busacchi and wrote a paper about the idea of equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And we thought that this really was in many ways a defining characteristic of the difference between open leagues and closed leagues. And that in many ways, conventional, what were then and still are to some extent conventional measures of competitive balance didn't really capture this difference, the difference that's driven by equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. So in the top panel here, you see from the paper the conventional sort of Knowles-Scully measures, which actually suggest that European League championships look fairly similar in terms of the competitive balance, and in fact, if anything, slightly more balanced based on the standard deviation of win percentages than the North American leagues. And yet, most people would recognize that there are some real differences in terms of the identity of champions and the turnover of champions at the top of leagues in North America. And the lower panel makes that point and points out just over these different periods how many different teams had won the championship. And broadly speaking, what's clear is that within the North American closed leagues, there is quite a high turnover of champions. There is quite a number of, most teams within the league get to win the league at some point. It varies depending on the league, but a very large fraction of teams are at some point become champions, whereas in the European system you see somewhat somewhat fewer teams actually ever reaching champion status, and the championships tend to be concentrated in the hands of a much smaller number of clubs. And we actually calculated, and we thought that this depended on the system of promotion and relegation, with promotion and relegation giving incentives enabling more teams to enter the market. So that's the equality of opportunity. But because within that system, the threat of failure for the big clubs makes them very unwilling to share any revenues or engage in any competition equalizing measures, you get this very unequal distribution of resources, unlike the sharing you see in North America, and that leads to the inequality of outcomes that you see in Europe relative to North America. And this diagram, these charts here, I always thought really summarize this very nicely. We worked out the statistical probabilities that teams would reach the top, would reach a given level in the championship, assuming equal chances to win. And those are the dotted lines on this on the charts. What the dashed lines suggest, this is actually the chances of reaching the one of the top 5 places in a given season, ranking teams by win percentages. And in the top panel, you can see for estimation for the NFL that the solid lines on the charts are what actually has happened. And you can see in the top panel that the dotted lines are pretty much superimposed on the solid lines. And what that means is that teams get into the top 5 places about as often as you would expect if everybody had an equal chance of winning every game. Whereas the lower panel shows you the example for the Italian, for Serie A, and what that shows is that if everybody had an equal chance of winning every game, by over a 50-year period, you would have seen more than 100 teams appear at least once in the top 5 ranks of the league, whereas in reality, the solid lines show you that actually no more than 20 teams have achieved that outcome. And that's the difference between the opportunity created by promotion or relegation and the reality of unequal competition, which we attributed largely to unequal sharing of resources. So I pursued this line of thought even further with Tommaso Valletti, where we wrote a paper in the mid-2000s about thinking about comparing open league and closed league contests from a theoretical perspective, and particularly trying to work out what were the, again, equilibrium incentives to supply effort, or if you like, devote resources to winning. And we also tried to develop theoretical propositions about the revenue sharing incentives. And what we showed in this was that in the open league system in general, you would see greater effort, greater expenditure of resources on winning, which again seems consistent with what we actually observe in the open league systems in Europe, and also much lower incentives to share revenues under most circumstances. Not under all circumstances, interestingly enough. There were some cases where you would get more revenue sharing in an open league system, but generally speaking, we found the incentives to share would be much more limited. And again, that does seem to be consistent with what we've observed in league systems in comparing the league systems in North America and Europe. But that brings me to the subject that I spent a lot of the last decade or so on, which is thinking about financial failure. Those effort incentives that are implicit in the open league system also provoke financial failure on a regular basis. And there was, in the 2000s, there was a lot of talk in the UK about this being a particularly British problem. And one of the points of this research was that's just not the case. This is a kind of universal problem. In particular, in that period, people were often pointing to Germany and France, where they had more highly regulated system, more intervention. In France by the government, in Germany by agreement amongst the clubs. And the claim was that the insolvencies that we were seeing in England in the 2000s could have been avoided if we had German or French style regulation. And one of the points we wanted to make, and this chart makes, is that actually the incidence of insolvency in those countries seems just as great as it is in England. We might argue, in fact, and this seems to be a fairly universal problem in football. And that, again, the point that I tended to make is that this is an inherent part of the promotion and relegation system. And again, many people in Europe have argued, and financial fair play itself, the regulatory system of UEFA, is predicated on the claim that these financial failures are a consequence of overinvestment, irrationality, lack of discipline. So if you like, it's a personal moral failing of those who run the clubs that they become insolvent. And what I've argued is that it's not that. That's not really the reason. The real reason is that the financial risks of relegation are so great that it's often hard to avoid insolvency. Relegation is a huge economic shock for a club. Clubs rationally devote large amounts of resources to avoiding relegation because they know it leads to a collapse in revenues, because the system guarantees that some teams that will be relegated, those that are relegated then actually go through that economic shock. The rational response is to try to cut costs as fast as revenues are falling, but that's inherently limited by contractual arrangements, which makes it hard to cut costs just in an instant, and also the rational calculation that if you cut costs by too much, you might just get relegated again, which is a real possibility and which could lead to even more severe financial crisis. So in some sense, insolvency is inherent in the system, and therefore trying to regulate clubs on the basis of arguing that they're being irrational is itself somewhat irrational. However, the other point that I've been making about insolvency in football is that it doesn't seem to be that much of a problem, in the sense that none of the clubs which fall into insolvency disappear. In fact, they often survive. My favorite example, of course, is Leicester City, which was bankrupt in 2002. Actually ended up getting relegated to the third level in 2008, but then came back and won the English Premier League, somewhat unexpectedly, in 2016. And it's hard to find any examples of any club in all of Europe of any size that has ever disappeared as a result of insolvency. The business that owns the club often disappears, but the club itself typically survives. And that's a very striking fact. If they didn't survive, what we would have seen in Europe is a kind of natural tendency towards the creation of a closed Superleague. And I like to compare this with baseball in the United States. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see a chart from the classic history of baseball written by Harold and Dorothy Seymour, written some time ago now. But this is a nice table showing the number of minor leagues in the United States between the years 1900 and 1930. So apart from 1918, where the number of leagues actually fell, number of teams finishing the season actually fell to 2. In most seasons, there were more than 10 minor leagues operating, and in one season, you see 47 different leagues starting the season. There's often a difference between starting and finishing because a lot of these leagues folded quite quickly. But clearly, go back to this period, and for most of the time, apart from the First World War, you see in America a very large number of independent minor leagues operating. And, you know, the question really to ask ourselves is, where did they go? To which one answer has always been, and one answer in the history books is, well, radio and television came along and they made minor leagues unattractive because people could see or hear a quality of competition that was much higher in the major leagues, and therefore they lost interest, and so the minor leagues died. Or ultimately, those that survived became part of a farm system for the major leagues, playing essentially meaningless competitions, which they do today. Well, that's only part of the story, of course, because television and radio came to Europe and people had the chance to watch high quality competition amongst the big clubs. And indeed, watching the Champions League is something that is incredibly popular across Europe, as it is in many other parts of the world these days. So you had a similar phenomenon in football, but you did not see this disappearance of independent minor leagues, if you will, or the teams in the lower divisions. And I would argue that's the difference is promotion and relegation. Within the promotion and relegation, within the closed league system of the United States, what was there to hope for in a minor league? If a minor league team got into financial difficulties, you could revive it financially by putting money in, but what would you get? Well, you just get the same level of competition that you've been playing in for years, which it turned out nobody was that interested in. So what's the point? Whereas in the promotion and relegation system, there's an incentive to revive a club that is insolvent, precisely because there's the possibility, the hope that you might someday rise up and play at a higher level of competition. And indeed, one would argue that in sports, as in life, hope is a fundamental driving factor, and therefore that hope that promotion gives to teams is what has driven the survival of all of these this vast network of small clubs across Europe that live permanently on the edge of financial ruin. Which gives us really a different take on the amenity value concept, amenity value of ownership concept, which is also relevant to the United States. When Steve Ballmer paid $2 billion for the LA Clippers, most people thought that it wasn't necessarily a financial proposition. It was more about just Ballmer wanting to be able to say he was an NBA owner. We can argue about the extent to which that's true, but there does seem there's good research to show that there does seem to be some significant amenity value in the ownership of franchises in North America. That's also fairly common sense view, I would say. Well, so amenity value in Europe, though, seems to mean something slightly different. Amenity value has as much to do with being the savior of your small town team, coming in and propping it up and ensuring its survival, and being a member of the local community in that way. It's a sort of different sort of amenity in a way, but it does seem to play a significant role. Which brings us to the sort of the idea of what sort of equilibrium we should think about in closed leagues, and this is something that I wrote about with Steve Ross, the Penn State law professor, who I've been a collaborator with for some time. And the idea in the North American case is that leagues will expand into the size where the marginal profit of expansion is approximately zero. If the markets were contestable, then you would think that expansion would reach maximizing levels, because if you didn't, then new leagues would enter and compete away your profit. So leagues would grow in size up to the point where there was no potential for a new team to enter, and demand was, there was an equilibrium, supply and demand, with no monopoly profits. But as is the case with many markets, if the market's not contestable, meaning there are sunk costs of entry, which involve things like player costs, player salaries, stadium fees, marketing expenses, which are not recoverable for an entrant should entry turn out not to be successful, that means that in effect creates a barrier to entry for rival leagues, which means that teams do not need to expand to the welfare optimum. They can expand to a much lower level, which therefore enables them to generate monopoly rents. And I mean, the classic story in America, of course, is the threat of relocation, which generates monopoly rents for the teams. So precisely because they haven't expanded to the welfare maximizing level, there's a pent-up demand by cities to host major league teams, and the members of the leagues are able to exploit that pent-up demand through demanding subsidies and relocating when they don't get them. And within this framework, the equilibrium behavior within these leagues is to eliminate as much economic competition as is possible within the league. So that's where you get the array of economic competition limiting activities like salary caps, gate and TV revenue sharing, the draft system, and so on. All of these serve to limit competition. And in fact, the only really countervailing power of this is the power of the player unions to bargain for rents and share in those rents. And of course, that's led to the interesting situation where the owners welcome player unions because player unions give them an antitrust exemption. Many of these arrangements would not be exempt from antitrust if there were no players unions, because player union agreements under US law are exempt from antitrust scrutiny. The equilibrium then in open league seems to me to be completely different. You have this characteristic of great inequality between the teams. You have dominance in the leagues by a small number of teams, and you have the remainder of the league living in a permanent state of distress, which and yet that seems to be some kind of an equilibrium. So the question is, how can you arrive at an equilibrium like that? And that's where I think I have argued in Money and Football, or Money and Soccer, which is a book I published in 2015, that really the right model for thinking about this is Sutton's model of endogenous sunk costs. And so the difference, the exogenous sunk costs are those costs involved really with investment in tangible fixed assets. So we think of classic things like the water supply or electricity good, which therefore limits, which creates economies of scale, and therefore means that you have natural monopolies in some sense, which need to be regulated. And Sutton contrasted that with a number of consumer industries where there seemed to be some costs, but that were not related to fixed, tangible fixed asset investments, but more with intangible fixed assets. And the classic example of Sutton was the example of Coca-Cola, where barriers to entry in something like bottling are actually quite limited and would not really warrant the kind of economies of scale which gives the to deliver the extent of market dominance that we see that the Coca-Cola Corporation has. And he argued that it's the investment in the intangible fixed assets, and in particular in this case he talked about advertising as being the sunk cost which created a barrier to entry, so that you cannot enter the soft drink business without committing billions of dollars to advertising, and that represents the barrier to entry. And indeed, Coca-Cola continues to spend billions of dollars every year on advertising, even though there can't be anyone on the planet who doesn't know what Coca-Cola is. And so Sutton's explanation is, well, that's really, it's not really about the consumers, it's about deterring entry by rivals. And I would argue that that's exactly what the big clubs are doing, but instead of it being advertising, it's investment in players. It's their investment in player contracts, which are also intangible fixed assets on the balance sheets of the clubs. And that is what is driving that sustains an equilibrium where we have an elite group of dominant clubs and a competitive fringe of teams that live on the edge of financial viability. And I think you can see this chart, which is quite old now, but it would look pretty much exactly the same today, compares the Forbes valuation of the franchises in 3 of the American major leagues, ranked just from the highest franchise to value to the lowest franchise value, and that is the solid line. And then the dashed line is the Forbes estimate of European football club team values, again ranked from highest to lowest. And the sort of thin line is an extrapolation of what that would mean for if you extended that from the top 20 clubs right down to club 92 in the list. And the simple story here is that you have the most valuable teams in Europe are typically worth more than the most valuable franchises in North America. But at the same time, this trails off very quickly in European football, and you quickly reach the competitive fringe whose economic value is very, very limited, whereas in the American system, even the least valuable franchise in North America is worth a lot more than the vast majority of football clubs in Europe. And so that's the difference between the equilibrium structures. And again, go back to the point where Tom and I think, were wrong in our 1999 paper is that we thought that this imbalance, which if anything has grown since 1999, we thought that that would make the system unsustainable. And it just hasn't. It actually, people seem to love football as much as they did 22 years ago, and if not more. And so and that must, and again, in some sense, it must be that competitive balance in the end doesn't matter that much to people. But I'm reaching some conclusions now, and one thing I want to say is that notwithstanding the collapse of this week's bizarre attempt to create a European Superleague, the demand is still there. JP Morgan was not crazy from an economic perspective to underwrite the venture for 3.25 billion euros. That's because they were confident that they could sell broadcast rights to the games amongst the top teams. So obviously TV viewing figures are often hard to come by, but this data, which is from the United States, seems to me to illustrate it very well. So the US is a good place to think about demand for the Champions League, simply because it's not European, and it gives you some sense of how these games appeal to people who are in some sense neutral, at least with regard to national identity. And what you can see is I've highlighted the bottom panel. It shows you the viewership in the US for teams in the group stages, and I've put them into 3 groups. Those games where in the group stages where there were no teams, from the 15 teams that the Super League thought that they were going to have. So the 12 clubs that signed up plus the 3 teams that refused, which were PSG, Bayern, and Dortmund. And you can see then there's the games between teams where one of the teams is from this ESL 15, and then finally the games where both teams are from the ESL 15. And you can see there these are bearing in mind that these games are played mostly in the middle of the afternoon in the United States, so the audiences are relatively small anyway. But you have an estimate of just over 50,000 TV viewers in the US when there are no teams from the ESL 15 playing. Over 200,000, so about 4 times as many when you have one team from the ESL 15, and then when both teams are from the ESL 15, you have over 400,000 viewers. So what, eight or so times as many as when there are no teams. Seems to me that's a pretty convincing explanation of the fact that, or a pretty justification of the claim that there is still huge pent-up demand for this. Extrapolate this to the rest of the world, and you can see how JP Morgan could expect to get their money back. So that's still the case, even though this the ESL has failed. That remains the case today, I think. And it's also the case that European football is still bankrupt. So it's almost exactly a year since I gave my first presentation to this Roses seminar about, and that was about COVID and the financial viability of the clubs. And one thing, I gave an analysis based on the financial statements for the years 2018-19, which had recently been published. And what I've just done this week is to update that analysis for the financial statements that have been published to date this year. And I have 38 clubs that have published financial statements. One thing to notice, it's a year on and only 38 clubs have published, whereas last year I had something like 72 that have published statements. That's partly because of COVID, that teams are postponing publishing their financial statements, partly because their financial statements are going to be very bad news, and they're trying to figure out how to handle that. But amongst those that are published, what you can see is falling revenues, particularly in the top 2 levels, and a significant decline in operating profitability. And the profits of the teams are lot, to the extent that they are propped up, particularly in the Premier League, they're really propped up by the value of player trading. And again, one of the questions is how much of that player trading is really going to be possible in the future when teams don't have cash to support themselves. Again, this current year, now having played now for a season without fans in the stadium, that represents a significant financial burden. And indeed, I would argue that that was exactly the plan of the ESL. Their plan was to buy off the remaining clubs in the Premier League and in the other domestic leagues by offering them a subsidy to tide them over the problems created by COVID, and that that was what they were going to use the JP Morgan money to do. And that strategy, and one reason why I'm fairly confident that that was the strategy is because that's exactly what Liverpool and Manchester United proposed last September in something called Project Big Picture, which made a lot of news in the UK because it involved exactly the same kind of idea, giving more control to the big clubs of the Premier League in exchange for a subsidy to the lower levels. Well, the financial problems are still there, though. They haven't gone away because the ESL has gone away. And whilst we haven't seen large-scale insolvencies yet, it still remains an open question about whether they're going to happen. So this brings me to conclude really about thinking about where we go from here, and perhaps this is something we can have a broad discussion about. The UK government was planning a review of English football anyway, and now they've brought that forward, and they're going to think about different policy options. And some of the options that will be looked at is, well, the first thing is obviously that's going to be on the list is bailouts. And again, bailouts, it might make some sense to bail out something that is so popular and that people love their football, and so it would be incredibly popular for the government to do that. And Boris Johnson is the man to do the thing that he thinks is popular with the electorate. However, although one thing the problem is that going to be, once the government bails out football once, that will not be the end of it. If the lessons of history of anything, then financial failure will be a regular occurrence amongst football clubs, and so there will be call for more bailouts. And it's interesting to think about whether the government really wants to be involved in perpetual bailouts of football. A second thing that we'll hear a lot about quite soon is a football regulator, somebody who is put in charge of a rather like the commissioners in the US, but maybe a government mandated regulator. I guess the question is what that regulator might do. What, in particular, what fans say they want. A regulator would respond to what fans say they want, but what fans say they want involves often quite contradictory things. So fans want promotion and relegation, but they don't want the financial consequences of promotion and relegation. Well, that's actually quite hard to manage. Fans want more revenue sharing. Well, in a league system that goes from Europe down to your local pub team, organizing significant revenue sharing is very difficult. Fans say they want salary caps, or salary caps will often prevent smaller clubs from rising up and competing with the bigger clubs. So in fact, that's that might end up being a difficult demand to meet. The third thing that we're seeing a lot of talk about is mandating fan representation, and again, the German 50+1 rule is a lot of talk about whether we should adopt that in England and maybe more broadly across Europe. I think this makes a lot of sense myself. I'm not sure I would go so far as 50+1. I think one of the things that would have stopped the ESL from happening would simply if you had fan representation of the board. It seems perfectly reasonable for the National Association to say that, for example, every football club board must have 10% of the membership decided by a fan group, and that might be a good way just to make, if the fans know about what's going on and they're informed because they have membership on the boards, then that would certainly help deal with plans to do things that the fans don't really want. Of course, the fourth thing is to do nothing, and that's not what people want right now. People want action, but it might be a very politically attractive approach to take. And in some ways, you might say that in what's happened this week shows that the system actually works. A group of owners wanted to do something that would limit competition. It would have been, in my view, an antitrust violation, but we didn't even need to go to court to get it stopped. It was just so unpopular that it was stopped dead in its tracks. And that would leave us with a system, the open system, which, with all its financial insecurity, which has been manifest over many decades, whilst that insecurity is there, it would continue to operate just as successfully as it has now. The regularity of financial failure has not actually undermined interest in football, and nor has the evidence of decreasing competitive balance. And again, goes back to what we said 22 years ago. If we said anything wrong, I think what we said wrong was that declining competitive balance would undermine interest in domestic competitions in European football. And I think we have to conclude that that just really has not been true. All right, well, I will finish it there and hopefully open up to a fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Very, very interesting, hugely topical discussion. We have almost exactly the 30 minutes that we normally allocate for Q&A and discussion. So if anyone does want to start off, please do feel free to raise your hand. There's a slight chance my computer, feeling the strain of so many people in this meeting, I might not spot a hand raised immediately. So if anyone else wants to, Stefan spots it, and a hand, or people just want to get their points in first, please do go right ahead. Johan.
Hi, Stefan. That was really informative. Really enjoyed that. Thank you so much. Just something on one of your first slides. You mentioned that something around economic theory is no use. Is it just culture? Just basically a comment, really thinking that if we look at it the other way around and actually look at consumer economic theory, do you think that's how the Superleague kind of fell apart in a sense? Because I'm thinking here you've got two key axioms there. You've got convexity, where obviously the European Super League suggests that we want this corner solution. We just want on one axis all the best clubs, but preferences seem to suggest that we don't have this corner solution. People prefer these mixtures of goods where they want to have that cold, wet, windy night in Stoke in the league. And the second thing is looking at kind of non-satiation. I remember back in 2011 where Barcelona and Real Madrid played each other, say, 4 or 5 times in the space of a month. And after the second game, I was fed up of that. And with this Super League and the way that was kind of envisioned that they'd play in Europe, apologies about the baby there, play in Europe and play domestically, there'd be so many of these fixtures, and I don't think fans really kind of bought that. So it's just a comment on what your opinions on that were, really, rather than a question.
Yeah, no, I think you make a great point, and I mean I'd really love to see a consumer theorist get to grips with what they think the nature of demand looks like. But what I would stress is the point I made near the end, which is the clear evidence of pent-up demand. I mean, there really are the global audience to see these big clubs play each other more often is, in my view, is vast. And just to give you an example, I counted up that in the last decade, the 12 clubs that were actually signed up for the Super League have played each other in the last decade 90 times in the Champions League when they're from different countries, just taking the teams from different countries. Whereas in the Super League, if they would play each other 90 times in one season. And I think the figures I showed you from US viewership would be reflected globally. That would just be a vast financial bonanza, and that's what J.P. Morgan thought. And they know about finance, right? And that's the thing. I think J.P. Morgan know about demand. They just made a phenomenally bad political calculation.
Super, thanks, Stefan.
Thanks, Johan. Thanks, Stefan. Roger's written something in the chat. And folk, if you want to ask questions, do raise your hand. Here we go. Roger says, if you want to combine an open system with competition limiting measures, what measures would you recommend?
That's a really great question. Should there be any competition limiting measures? I mean, I've written against financial fair play because I think one of the things that has been good about the open system is that the way that new teams have come in and competed at the top, and particularly in England, where the way you have seen Manchester City and Chelsea with large sums of money injected by wealthy owners, challenging the dominance of the top of Manchester United, Arsenal, and Liverpool. And what we have in the Premier League these days is in some ways what's become a more balanced competition, precisely because of that open entry of finance. And whereas I would contrast Germany, where the 50+1 rule, I think, actually helps sustain the dominance of Bayern, which I think is a problem in Germany right now. So I'm tempted to argue that no restraints is the right answer. Is that actually unfettered competition is good as long as we preserve promotion and relegation. It'll play out, and we will have a supremely a high level of investment in attractive competitions.
Roger asks, I don't know how seriously the suggestion is, but his follow-up is, how about a handicap system?
Yeah, the issue is if what was happening was that the big clubs were running away with it, and people were stopping watching, and there was interest was declining. If there was any evidence of declining interest, then I think that kind of idea would be valuable. But this is what the American league system does. It does involve handicaps. I mean, you have a luxury tax in baseball. It's limiting the ability of teams to compete, which actually works in the American context of a closed league system, but again, in my view, is inappropriate for the open league system that we have in Europe.
Okay, Jorge Trova has his hand up. Jorge, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, Stefan. Great talk. Thank you. I have, I guess, two questions, comments. One on how to deal with risk of relegation. What do you think about the system they have here in South America, which was generated in Argentina, where relegation is based on a 3-year basis, 3-year average. So that was designed in order for big teams not to be relegated so easily. In fact, when River Plate went down, it was just 3 or 4 seasons that they were doing really bad. That's one thing, I don't like it in particular, but I would like to know what you think about it. And the other thing is, in terms of that table you had on viewership in the United States that you can expand to the world, which I think one of the problems of the Super League is that I would say it's different. You did this nice argument that the big 15 teams had more viewership. I would say it's not necessarily the big 15, or the 15 teams, but the fact that they play the later stage of the Champions League. Because if you go back years and remember those games between Deportivo La Coruña and Milan, or Deportivo La Coruña and Porto in semifinals, we were all watching those games, and that was the big or one of the major problems of the Super League. The fact that in football, we know the dynamics of the big teams really change. Essentially, only Real Madrid is the only team that has been a big team for the entire history of football. But there is all these dynamics, and they were closing on that, and I think that was a big problem. I just comments and questions to see what you think about it.
Yeah, no, I mean those are both good points. I mean, I think as far as what the table I showed you, I was actually just looking at group stage games, so I wasn't even just focusing on group stage. There was much bigger audience for the ESL 15 than the other games, and that's not. We could argue a little bit about that, but I do think it seems like the difference in the levels is so great that I think it's hard to argue that it's not about the attractiveness of these teams. Again, it's not necessarily about the clubs; it's about the players. What you want to see is Mbappe going up against Harry Kane. You want to see Neymar and Gnabry playing each other. It's these kind of matchups of the players that people are interested in. That's what the ESL really offered. And I think there just is. Just forget about the names of the clubs and think about the names of the players, and I think you see why it's potentially so attractive. I'm not sure I got your first point. The sound wasn't perfect my end, but I think what you were saying was about what's the problem with when big clubs get relegated and what happens then. That generally speaking, that is rarely the case. Largely because in the open system, the big clubs are so dominant, they really are at very limited risk. And in those very rare occasions where they do go down, usually that actually reinvigorates support for the big club. And so in some sense, and also reinvigorates the lower division as well for a year. And so I guess a good example is the experience of Rangers in Scotland. And I don't know whether Rangers fans would agree with me, but I think that was actually quite good for Scottish football in general to see them have to go down to the bottom and work their way up. In fact, I'm sure Rangers fans will disagree with me, and I'm sure all Scottish fans will disagree with that because they have very strong views about it. But from an outsider's perspective, I thought that actually worked rather well.
Thanks, Hoehn. Thanks, Stefan. Just before we go to the other two hands that are up, Carl has put in, what about a salary cap?
Yeah, again,
salary cap, he's saying, actually.
So here's one of the things I think is about the nature of this. So what I set up at the beginning was this distinction between two systems, an open system and a closed system. And I argued that, and I would argue that salary caps and revenue sharing and draft systems, these are all implicit in a closed system. They are all natural adjuncts to a closed league system. They don't. I also think that they don't fit in an open league system, and they don't fit because it's hard to see. I mean, what would a salary cap do in the top division? It would handicap teams playing in Europe, so that would make the European competition less attractive, and it would create more competitive balance in the domestic competition. But like I say, the evidence seems to be that people don't care very much about competitive balance. It doesn't seem to matter very much. So what would be the benefit of that? And it seems to me that what a lot of people want to do is they say, let's keep our open system, but let's take a bunch of things that they do in closed systems. And I'm skeptical that that really is a sensible policy approach. So my sense is that can you have a convex combination of these systems? I don't think you do. I think it's one or the other. And to get all the benefits of the open system, you actually have to leave it to be relatively unregulated.
Okay, so we've got a couple of hands. Peter was first, followed by Tom. So Peter, go ahead.
Hi everyone. My name is Peter Reade and I work at the BBC, and I'm not an economist, although I found it absolutely fascinating. So I've got two very quick questions. First of all, just wonder what the economic definition of bankruptcy is. Stefan, you said European football is bankrupt. I'm struggling to understand how any of the teams that we're putting in for the ESL are bankrupt, and they are non-sustainable businesses. And the second part to that is, do you now feel
he was frozen?
Oh, just as he was asking the second question. That's someone in the BBC has decided that he's said far too much already, and that this must stop right now.
Well, I guess hopefully Peter can join us again, but perhaps we can go to Tom, and then when Peter rejoins, we can go back to his question if he rejoins. Tom, do you want to go ahead? You're on mute.
Tom, turn your voice on. You're muted.
Sorry, I've only just back on. Hi, Stefan. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Peter.
I do apologise. Sorry, my entire internet went off then. So I don't know where I left you. I do apologise. I've just logged back in. So my question one was about bankruptcy and the notion, and the second one was whether you feel the ESL is now, the premise is now dead for a generation.
Well, so in terms of bankruptcy, yeah, I would say when I said the whole of European football is bankrupt, I would accept from that there's probably maybe 100 clubs in Europe that aren't really technically insolvent. But effectively, how I would define bankruptcy is there are a number of ways you could do this. One is to do it on the basis of assets. So when your liabilities exceed your assets, you're technically bankrupt. And secondly, when if your earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization are negative, then you're broadly insolvent. In other words, the money that you generate from your business activity is not enough to cover your day-to-day operating costs. And that's true for a very, very large fraction of clubs across Europe. And these clubs survive largely because they are underwritten by their owners. Their owners are pumping in typically quite small amounts of money. I mean, in League Two, it could be, something like, £50,000, which, for most of us, that sounds like a lot of money. But, for a lot of wealthy individuals who run somewhat larger businesses, these are relatively small sums. So that's the sense in which I think that most of European football is technically insolvent. Is it dead for a generation? Well, I don't. That is a really good question. Maybe so. I mean, again, this is where politics bumps up against economics. The economic imperative or the economic logic of expanding competition for these big clubs remains. It seems to me that's the point I was trying to make with the viewing data. But I think John Henry and Joel Glazer and Stan Kroenke are going to keep quiet for a little bit. We're not going to hear too much from them in the short term, but they may come back with this at some point. Tom, you were going to say something, but you need to unmute yourself. You're muted. You're still muted.
I can unmute.
The classic beginner's error there, Tom.
Yeah, I set this up specifically. I wasn't going to have my co-author say anything about our paper, so I deliberately planned it. So he's permanently muted, can't speak. Put up a sign. Say, put up a banner.
It's in the upper right hand. The upper right hand to the right.
Tom, go to the top of your screen. You'll see a microphone and just tap it. Never going to happen.
I say Tom is a very high-powered consultant who works for some of the major corporations in the world. So he's really impressive with the technology.
Can't he just type in the chat?
You can actually, Tom, if you can see it.
Yeah, or you say type in the chat that everything I said was wrong, and he's going now. No, I think he's going to try and log on again. See if he can.
Maybe we'll go to Rasmus while Tom rejoins. Hopefully Rasmus can unmute himself.
Yeah, sure. I'll try.
There you go.
So does it work now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Tom. Now, finally, at last.
I'm allowed to. I'm just dialed in again. So, okay. I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question to Steph, which I think would be interesting for the audience. The first comment is, why did we get it so badly wrong for 20 years? And I want to remind myself and also Steph, we actually thought about breaking up and remodeled the situation. It's very costly to leave the existing multiple open league system and set up a closed league, which is what we said should happen or would happen. There are maybe several reasons for do that. You are giving something up. You're giving up domestic competition. If you think of the Premier League, there is a lot of active competition between top clubs, and it's no surprise to me that the European Super League concept had 6 English clubs, because 2 English clubs, would they go in order to play those European rivals? They would give up a lot. So there's this problem of leaving the existing world, and also to do with that is the English Premier League is considered to be very valuable and has assembled a lot of talent and has generates lots of revenue and is very popular. So in a way, it's become a little bit like a mini Super League in one country, bringing together that top talent and playing each other more often. So that's quite an interesting aspect. So the second thing is, my question is about promotion and relegation. I think we discussed this many years ago. There is the problem of yearly promotion and relegation. So what do you think, Steph, of the concept of 3-yearly promotion and relegation rounds, where clubs who get promoted have the ability to stay for 3 years in whatever league. So this applies to open and to close, to an open system here, and potentially to a future Super League. That would allow them to invest in player talent and have a chance to stay up. So, you know, what is your thought about such a system?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And yeah, so like you, I'm trying to rack my brains to remember what we said all those years ago to each other, because we had a lot of conversations about it and we thought about it a lot. So again, on the promotion relegation, again, my question, I guess I would answer your question with a question: is what is the problem that you're trying to solve? What we thought back 22 years ago, it seems to me, was that the current system was unsustainable because of the imbalances that it would create in the system. And it strikes me that what we've seen is that these imbalances don't matter to people, that actually things have, if anything, they've become more imbalanced in 22 years. And yet the level of popularity, the level of interest has not diminished, it's grown. So again, I suppose my question is, what would it be? What's the problems being addressed? One thing that I just to mention as well. I was looking for reading this. I was looking up what people said about Project Big Picture. So one thing, if you're interested in what happened this week and you're not familiar with Project Big Picture from last September, October, you really should go and look at what happened then, because really it was very much the ESL version, but just applied to the Premier League. So I think that's interesting. I was reading one comment based in an interview with John Henry, and expressing what his philosophy was behind this Project Big Picture. And he was saying that he was frustrated by the English clubs. He was frustrated by the small clubs, because his view was that all they were interested in was survival in the Premier League. They're always looking down, they never look up. That was what he said. And it struck me that was an interesting kind of philosophical take on what was going on. That's exactly how the promotion relegation system works. You're constantly facing the fear of going down, and you're not thinking about moving up to bigger and greater things. And that actually seems to work for people. But it's also, most Americans say that they don't like the idea of promotion and relegation. And that's perhaps because, again, in an American context, and maybe this is about culture, it's that Americans always like to be looking up. They don't like to be looking down.
Okay, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Stefan. Rasmus is next up.
Thank you. Hi, Stefan. Nice to meet you. This was a very good presentation. So I have this is mainly related to one of your last slides on what is going to happen now, because as far as I can see, this idea is of course dead now, but I think it will come up again. And I was thinking about the book you wrote with Andrew Simplelist some years ago, where you actually suggested some kind of compromise between the American and the European system. And to all the other listeners, it is about, briefly sketched out, it's about trying to make an overnational European league with promotion and relegation from some regional sub-leagues. I just wanted to hear a comment on that. Would that be a possible way to go forward if someone again wanted to establish a European Super League in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Rasmus. I think it's that's the danger with writing these things. You people then bring them back up and say, well, what didn't you say back then that this was a good idea? And I do think, again, I think what we were saying in that book was again building on what Tom and I had done in the Super League paper, and saying, is there a way to have a European-wide competition that involves the big teams playing on a regular basis while still preserving promotion and relegation with domestic competition? And in some ways, that's effectively what UEFA have been trying to do for the last 30 years. I mean, that is in some ways, what is the UEFA project? The UEFA project is to create a Super League without destroying the promotion and relegation system. And what I think we can say is they're sort of halfway there at the moment. I mean, we've just had this latest expansion, and they're moving towards this gradually. And it could be that this Super League idea will go away eventually. I mean, I think also it's one question which goes back to what Tom was saying is it that we've actually created a Super League, it's called the Premier League, or is it that we can create a European Super League which would be under the auspices of, which would be effectively the Champions League? So those are kind of two alternatives as well that you could think about. And if the Premier League just becomes the global Super League, which in some ways it is, not completely, of course, but in some ways it already is, that obviates again any need to think about doing away with promotion and relegation as well.
Thanks, Rasmus. Before we go to the last two questions, Stefan, your camera's turned off. I don't know if that was on purpose.
Oh.
Well, it might be that I can't see it.
No,
I can.
It says here that it's on.
I can see you again now. It could be mine, of course. But we've got Christoph and then Alex for the last two questions.
I need to show this, right? This is the latest book. That's the one you should be buying. City of Champions, about the history of sports in Detroit. Anyway, advertisement over.
Well, I also wanted to say thank you very much. It was a very inspiring talk. And I was wondering, because I really find it surprising that your prediction in terms of lowering interest has not come true. I have started as a soccer fan at the age of 10 in '94, started watching the Bundesliga, and I really have been watching every game that I could, every weekend, all the time from the matches. And I must admit that I got kind of bored with Bayern Munich, my favorite club, winning now straight one after the other every time the Bundesliga. So that now I really have in myself the hope that they are not going to win. That's Borussia Dortmund, for instance, would win, just to get some more interest back. And I'm wondering if, because I also know from other people that this has been the case. So I'm wondering, the fact that the total numbers have not lowered, could this not simply be due to the fact that the world population has increased enormously over the past years, that more and more broadcasting is happening, but that percentage-wise it has lowered, and that if we reach some kind of a stop in the population increase, that then one would really see the effect of the effect that you were foreseeing. Can it not just be some effect like that?
Thanks, Christoph. I mean, that's a great point, and I think to me that sounds like an appeal for empirical research, which I think is a great point, and we definitely need more empirical research on measuring the impact of inequality on demand for sport in general. And because I think one thing to say is, in the last 30 years, we have been through a series of quite extraordinary technological advances. So so one thing, when we were writing the paper, one of the things we said in the paper was that the average revenue of a Premier League club was £17 million. So think about that. I mean, the economic scale of football has just exploded, and you can attribute that in part to globalization. It is now, you can go into any bar pretty much anywhere in the world now and watch a Premier League game, which obviously you couldn't do 25 years ago. You can actually probably see it quite a few places, but not quite as completely as now. And it's a fair point to say, just because things have been growing significantly over the last 20 years doesn't mean to say they'll continue to grow. So in some sense, again, this is a classic econometric problem. To what extent do we attribute the growth in revenues and the growth in audiences simply to changing technologies? And is there within that some residual loss of interest? And because the other thing I'd say to you, Christoph, is, you know, and I don't wish to be rude, but we're all getting older, and I think it's often the case that as you get older, you lose a bit of interest. And the question I always say to people, the question really is, what are the kids watching? And that's what I'm really interested in. What do people in the age group 10 to 25, what are they interested in? And that would actually be the best way to see what the trends, what the real trends are, it seems to me.
Yeah, I fully agree. That's a good point.
Thank you. Stefan, one final quick question before we wrap up. Alex.
Stefan, thank you very much for your very nice presentation, as usually. I'm going back to the basics of economics. And as far as I understand economics, the higher the supply is, the lower is the value. Like, right? So you'll have many, so this is a question about this Superleague, maybe not super related to what exactly you were talking about, but if you have too many games between Real Madrid and Barcelona, there will be kind of cannibalization. The value of these games will be lower than if you have a game between Real Madrid, Barcelona that competes against a match of Molde versus Maccabi Haifa, for example. Right? And now you have two games, Barcelona, Real Madrid, and this game competes with the game Manchester United and Manchester City. So JP Morgan, do you really think they took it into account?
Yeah, oh yeah, no. So I mean, the idea that if you increase, there's, I mean, again, supply and demand. If supply is artificially lowered, and then you reduce that artificial restraint on supply, what will happen? The idea that you won't have a huge expansion in output and consumption seems to me to be wrong. So think about your classic supply-demand curve, upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, and you constrain supply at some point because there's a restriction on the big clubs playing each other under the rules of the system, and that will be to the left of the equilibrium point. You remove that restriction, boom, a huge increase in supply and demand, and new equilibrium. So I mean, that seems to me to be logically the case. So I mean, it's good that you're saying that we should think about this in terms of economic theory. I think that's right. The question is, I guess, you know, what is, you know, just how far that would go, whether there's any limit at all to this. And again, you know, this now famous banner, "We want our wet evenings, Friday evenings in Slough." You know, we want this low-level competition. We want to be able to do that. I mean, the question is how much demand there is for that. And again, I would say, go back to my previous point and say, let's ask the 10 to 25-year-olds what they want.
Okay. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. We've gone over a little bit over our allotted time. Some more comments in the chat, which will still be there after we leave the conversation. So, Stefan, they're there for you to respond to. A number of interesting comments reflecting truly fascinating talk, timely, topical, built on a lot of research done over a long period of time, and an honest talk as well, accepting where where our knowledge increases over time, and we get to revisit opinions and see things again. So thank you once again, Stefan. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. We will return again this time next week for our 51st Reading Online Sport Economics seminar, which will be by Nicola Portanovis, entitled "Better by Design: Collaboration and Performance in the Board Game Industry." So thanks, everyone, once again, and I wish you all a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.